The war room of the Kethmoran flagship Inevitable Certainty had been designed to intimidate lesser species into submission. Holographic displays mapped conquered systems in soothing blue, while crimson markers indicated ongoing pacification operations. Today, however, the room resembled less a monument to imperial precision and more a therapy session for mathematically obsessed beings having an existential crisis. "Explain to me again," High Calculator Vexthon said, his 4 eyes fixed on the stellar readouts, "how a species that still uses combustion engines managed to destabilize fusion reactions across 17 star systems." Fleet Commander Zarketh, whose exoskeleton bore the scars of 300 successful campaigns, gestured helplessly at the data streams. "The humans launched 47 devices, crude things. Our sensors classified them as desperate attempts at kinetic bombardment. Kinetic bombardment that ignored our fleets entirely and somehow convinced our sons to have performance anxiety." Vexthon's mandibles clicked in what passed for sarcasm among his species. "Brilliant tactical assessment, Commander." The room's other occupants, a collection of Kethmoran military and scientific elite who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with sufficient computational power, watched their displays with the stunned expression of beings whose entire worldview had just been fed through a garbage disposal. Senior analyst Kelnara spoke up, her voice carrying the particular strain that came from running calculations that refused to make sense. "The devices aren't weapons in any conventional understanding. They appear to be some sort of resonance generators that interfaced with stellar magnetic fields and—" "And what, analyst?" Zarketh interrupted. "Convinced 17 suns to dim by 15% in the past 3 cycles? Asked them politely to consider early retirement?" "The humans call them stellar resonance torpedoes," Kelnara continued, ignoring the commander's tone. "Though torpedo implies they were meant to explode. These didn't explode. They integrated. They're still active, still broadcasting their resonance patterns, still somehow disrupting fusion efficiency across multiple star systems that should be completely independent of each other." Vexthon pulled up a holographic model of the affected region. Each star pulsed with an unhealthy orange glow instead of their usual steady brilliance. "How long do we have?" "Conservative estimates suggest total stellar collapse within 6 local months," Kelnara reported. "Though conservative assumes we understand what we're looking at, which we demonstrably do not." The silence that followed carried the weight of an empire suddenly discovering that its 3,000-year winning streak might be coming to an abrupt and cosmically embarrassing end. "Sir," a junior technician spoke up from his station, "we're receiving similar reports from the Outer Four territories, stars in the Velthar system, the Mordax cluster, even the core worlds around Keth Prime are showing resonance echoes." Commander Zarketh's secondary arms, which usually remained folded in a display of confident calm, began twitching. "Echoes from what?" "Unknown, sir. It's as if the original resonance patterns are propagating through some medium we can't detect, spreading from star to star like a virus," Vexthon finished. "A stellar virus designed by a species that, according to our intelligence reports, discovered fire approximately 50,000 years after we achieved faster-than-light travel." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. The Kethmoran Empire prided itself on being the galaxy's foremost practitioners of applied xenology. They studied species for decades before making contact, cataloging their technological capabilities, social structures, and military potential with obsessive thoroughness. Earth had been classified as threat level negligible, with the notation recommend standard pacification protocols. Standard pacification protocols did not typically include having one's stellar infrastructure held hostage by a species still arguing about whether their planet was getting warmer. "How did they even acquire the technology?" Zarketh demanded. Stellar engineering requires computational matrices that would take them centuries to develop. Kelnara hesitated before answering. Sir, preliminary analysis suggests the devices incorporate Kethmoran technology, specifically components from our own stellar maintenance platforms. The war room fell silent, except for the gentle hum of life support systems and the quiet sobbing of several junior officers who had just realized their careers were over. They reverse-engineered our stellar engineering technology, Vexthon said slowly, and used it to build weapons that we didn't recognize as weapons because they were too sophisticated for us to understand. It appears so, sir. And they launched these weapons knowing full well that activating them would likely result in their own extinction, since Earth's sun is also showing signs of resonance destabilization. Correct, sir. Vexthon stared at the holographic display for a long moment, watching the slow pulse of dying stars. Has anyone considered that we might have made an error in our threat assessment? Commander Zarketh, whose military doctrine had never included provisions for enemies willing to commit mutual stellar suicide, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to ask the question that would haunt Kethmoran strategists for generations to come. Sir, what exactly do we do with a species insane enough to kill suns? The detention level of the inevitable certainty had been constructed according to standard imperial guidelines, efficient, sterile, and psychologically crushing. What it hadn't been designed for was housing prisoners who seemed genuinely amused by their circumstances. Dr. Elena Vasquez lounged in her cell as if it were a university lecture hall, watching her Kethmoran interrogator pace back and forth with barely concealed desperation. Beside her, former Admiral Chen Wei sat cross-legged on his bunk, humming what sounded suspiciously like an ancient earth-drinking song. Let me understand this correctly, Interrogator Prime Nexeval said, his translator rendering his frustration in perfectly crisp English. You knew the stellar resonance devices might not function as designed. Oh, they're functioning exactly as designed, Vasquez replied cheerfully. The question is whether our design was any good. We had about 6 weeks to figure out technology that took you people millennia to perfect. Not exactly ideal conditions for peer review. Nexeval stopped pacing. 6 weeks? From initial concept to launch, yes. Though to be fair, we'd been studying the wreckage of your maintenance drones for almost 8 months before we figured out what they actually did. She gestured vaguely at the walls. You really shouldn't leave advanced technology lying around after orbital bombardments. Very sloppy. You built stellar weapons based on maintenance drone components? Nexeval's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sure sign of cognitive overload. Without testing? Without proper mathematical modeling? Admiral Chen looked up from his humming. Testing would have required a spare star system, bit of a luxury item during an extinction event. But the computational requirements alone. We used every quantum computer on the planet, Vasquez interrupted, plus a few thousand gaming rigs and about 12 million smartphones, distributed processing at its finest, though I suspect your species doesn't have a cultural concept for crowd-sourced astrophysics. Nexeval consulted his datapad, clearly struggling with information that violated every protocol in the Kethmoran handbook. Your files indicate the project had a 37% probability of success. 37.4, Chen corrected. We were very precise about our imprecision. And you proceeded anyway? Seemed better than 0%, Vasquez said with a shrug, which was roughly our survival rate under your previous plan. The interrogator's mandibles clicked rapidly, a nervous habit that his species had tried to breed out of their diplomatic corps for exactly this reason. This is incomprehensible. No rational civilization would stake everything on such uncertain odds. Lucky for us, we're not particularly rational, Chen observed. Rationality is what got you into this mess in the first place. You calculated that we were harmless, therefore we must be harmless. Very logical, also spectacularly wrong. Nexval activated a holographic display showing the current stellar degradation patterns. Do you comprehend what you've done? 17 star systems are dying. Trillions of beings face extinction. Funny thing about extinction, Vasquez mused. It really clarifies your priorities. You start asking different questions. Like, instead of, what are the odds of success? You start wondering, what happens if we don't try? But the mathematics said we were already dead, Chen cut him off. Your orbital platforms had sterilized 60% of our surface. Your ground forces were systematically eliminating population centers. Mathematics suggested our species had maybe 3 months left, so we stopped doing math and started doing desperation. Nexval stared at the humans as if they were exotic specimens that had somehow learned to speak. You gambled the lives of trillions on desperation? No, Vasquez said, her tone shifting to something colder. You gambled the lives of trillions when you decided to wipe out our species. We just changed the stakes. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Chen resumed his humming, apparently finding the interrogation less pressing than whatever song was stuck in his head. There must be a way to reverse the process, Nexval said eventually. The resonance patterns, the stellar integration, surely the same technology could be used to stabilize fusion reactions instead of disrupting them. Vasquez exchanged a look with Chen. Well, yes. Theoretically. Theoretically? The devices would need to be manually recalibrated, Chen explained. Each one, individually, while maintaining precise synchronization across multiple star systems. Oh, and the recalibration process requires direct neural interface with the resonance matrix. Direct neural interface with stellar plasma, Vasquez added helpfully, just to be completely accurate about the technical requirements. Nexval's translator struggled for a moment before producing what might have been either a curse or a prayer in his native tongue. That would be fatal. Extremely fatal, Chen agreed. Essentially, you'd need volunteers willing to pilot ships into the heart of dying stars and become permanently integrated with stellar cores. Not exactly a recruitment poster career opportunity. The interrogator processed this information with the expression of someone who had just realized that salvation required the cooperation of the very beings his empire was attempting to exterminate. Would your species consider such a mission? Vasquez smiled with the particular satisfaction of someone who had just heard exactly the question she'd been waiting for. Why, Interrogator Prime Nexval, are you asking us for help? The Grand Assembly Chamber aboard the Inevitable Certainty had hosted the surrender ceremonies of 43 different species. Today, it was witnessing something unprecedented. The most powerful military force in the galaxy, preparing to negotiate with prisoners they'd been systematically killing for the past 4 months. High Calculator Vexthon stood at the central podium, addressing a holographic conference that included representatives from every major power in the affected regions. The irony wasn't subtle. Half the beings attending this emergency session were species that the Kethmoran Empire had either conquered, subjugated, or intimidated into compliance over the past millennium. The situation is deteriorating faster than our models predicted, Vexthon announced to the assembled delegates. Stellar degradation has now reached cascade failure points in 22 systems. Ambassador Thilla of the Centauri Collective, a species whose homeworld had been liberated by Kethmoran forces just 50 years earlier, leaned forward with obvious satisfaction. Fascinating. And you're certain this was caused by the humans? Absolutely certain, Fleet Commander Zarketh replied through gritted mandibles. Though caused might not be the appropriate term. Orchestrated seems more accurate. By a pre-interstellar species, added Representative Kolvar from the Outer Rim territories, his species' traditional enemies of the Kethmoran Empire. who, according to your previous reports, were too primitive to pose any meaningful threat. The Kethamoran delegation endured this particular humiliation with the stoic grace of beings who had recently discovered that their reputation for infallible strategic planning had some significant gaps. The technical details are irrelevant, Vexthon said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. What matters is that the humans claim they can reverse the process. Claim? Thilla's equivalent of an eyebrow raised. You don't sound convinced. The reversal procedure requires... Zarketh paused, clearly struggling with the words. It requires pilot crews to manually interface with each resonance device while embedded in stellar cores. The survival rate for such missions would be 0%. A moment of stunned silence filled the chamber before Representative Kolvar began what could only be described as laughing, though his species produced the sound by rapidly cycling through 3 different breathing apertures. Let me understand this completely, Kolvar wheezed between cycles. The humans built weapons that require suicide missions to deactivate, and you're surprised that they might be willing to fly suicide missions. The mathematical absurdity of it, Vexthon began, is exactly what makes it brilliant, interrupted a new voice. Dr. Vasquez and Admiral Chen had been escorted into the chamber, still in detention restraints, but looking remarkably composed for beings who were technically prisoners of war. You weren't invited to speak, Zarketh snapped. You weren't invited to sterilize our planet, Vasquez replied pleasantly. Yet here we all are, making the best of an awkward situation. Ambassador Thilla gestured for the humans to continue. I think we'd all benefit from hearing their perspective on the matter. Chen stepped forward, his restraints clinking softly. Your problem isn't technical. You understand the science now. Your problem is philosophical. You can't comprehend why anyone would volunteer for certain death to save people who were trying to kill them. It defies all logical frameworks, Vexthon protested. Does it? Vasquez asked. Or does it just defy your logical frameworks? Because from where we're standing, the logic is pretty straightforward. We're already dying. You've made sure of that. But dying while saving star systems full of innocent civilians? That's what we call going out with style. Representative Kolvar leaned back in his environmental suit. How many volunteers would you need? 47, Chen replied immediately. 1 for each device. Though honestly, we'd probably get more volunteers than we need. Humans are weird about heroic last stands. The chamber fell quiet as the assembled delegates processed this information. The Kethamoran Empire, which had spent 3 millennia perfecting the art of calculated conquest, was being offered salvation by the very species they'd been exterminating. And the offer came with a casualty rate that would make their own military strategists resign in protest. What assurances do we have that this isn't some elaborate revenge plot? Zarketh demanded. How do we know you won't simply make the situation worse? Vasquez smiled with the particular warmth usually reserved for explaining simple concepts to small children. Commander, our entire planet is currently being reduced to radioactive slag by your orbital platforms. Our species is facing extinction whether we help you or not. If this was about revenge, we'd just sit back and watch your sons die while we enjoy our remaining weeks of existence. Then why help at all? Thilla asked. Because spite is boring, Chen said. And because saving 17 star systems seems like a better legacy than being remembered as the species that accidentally broke stellar physics out of sheer bloody-mindedness. The holographic displays around the chamber continued their quiet documentation of stellar decay. Each flickering sun a reminder that philosophical debates had expiration dates. High Calculator Vexthon straightened his ceremonial robes and asked the question that would fundamentally reshape galactic politics for the next 1,000 years. What are your terms? 6 months later, the memorial walls on New Geneva Station bore 47 names written in languages from across the galaxy. Each inscription told the same story in different words. Someone had volunteered to become permanently integrated with stellar cores to save worlds they'd never seen, populated by species they'd never met. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that humanity's memorial station orbited a planet that no longer existed. Captain Rivera stood before the memorial, her new insignia marking her as Director of Interstellar Stellar Operations, a position that hadn't existed before humans proved that certain kinds of madness could be weaponized. Behind her, Ith, mixed crew of Kethmoran engineers and human technicians monitored the stabilization readings from the rescued star systems. "Final report from the Velthar system," announced Technician Okafor, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that came from coordinating miracle operations. "Fusion stability restored to 96% nominal. Core integration successful." "That's all of them," Rivera said quietly. 47 systems stabilized. 47 pilots who aren't coming home. Former Fleet Commander Zar Keth, now bearing the diplomatically awkward title of Kethmoran Liaison for Human Affairs, approached with the careful gait of someone still adjusting to not being in charge of anything important. "The Empire's debt to your species can't be paid," Rivera interrupted, which was rather the point. "You wanted to understand human psychology? Congratulations. You now owe us everything, and we made sure you could never repay it." Zarketh's mandibles clicked uncertainly. "I don't understand." "Of course you don't. That's why you're in this position." Rivera turned from the memorial to face him. "Your species thinks in terms of calculated exchanges. Resource for resource, service for service, territory for technology. But 47 people just became permanent residents of stellar cores to save your civilization. How exactly do you calculate the exchange rate on that?" The question hung in the recycled air of the station, while automated systems quietly tracked the pulse patterns of distant suns that now carried human consciousness in their hearts. "The galactic response has been interesting," Zarketh offered, clearly struggling to find safer conversational ground. Interesting was diplomatic understatement. 3 species had formally requested human military advisors. 7 more had opened cultural exchange programs. The Centauri Collective had gone so far as to establish a joint research initiative focused on what their academics were calling strategic irrationality theory. Most significantly, the Kethmoran Empire found itself in the unprecedented position of being simultaneously the galaxy's dominant military power and everyone's least favorite neighbor at interstellar dinner parties. "The Outer Rim territories are calling it the human doctrine," Zarketh continued. "The concept that any species willing to commit stellar suicide for tactical advantage should be approached with extreme caution and possibly flowers." Rivera actually smiled at that. "Flowers?" "Ambassador Thilla's suggestion. Her reasoning was that beings capable of weaponizing star systems probably have unconventional criteria for determining friend from foe." "Smart woman. How's recruitment going for the new Stellar Guard Corps?" Zarketh consulted his datapad with obvious reluctance. "We've received over 50,000 applications from 37 different species, all requesting assignment to ships crewed by humans. Because everyone wants to serve alongside the species crazy enough to kill suns? Because everyone wants to be certain they're not on the opposite side if you decide to kill more suns." The conversation was interrupted by a soft chime from the memorial wall. Each name briefly pulsed with bioluminescent text as the integrated consciousness of former Lieutenant Marcus Webb transmitted his daily status report from the core of what had once been a dying star in the Kethmoran home system. "Still conscious," Rivera read aloud. "Stellar fusion patterns optimal. Send coffee." "He requests coffee every day," Zarketh observed. "We've explained repeatedly that the delivery challenges are insurmountable. He knows that. It's called humor. Another human concept your empire might want to study. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the distant stars through the station's observation ports. Some of those points of light now contained human minds, keeping ancient fusion reactions stable through sheer force of will and the kind of stubborn determination that had once convinced an entire species to build weapons they couldn't properly test. "Captain Rivera," Zarketh said eventually, "may I ask you a personal question?" "Shoot." "Do you believe your species would do this again, if faced with similar circumstances?" Rivera considered the question seriously, her gaze drifting across the memorial names. "Commander, you spent 4 months systematically exterminating us, and we responded by saving your entire civilization at the cost of our best people. What do you think?" Zarketh processed this for a moment before asking the follow-up question that had been keeping Kethmoran strategists awake at night. "Then what should we do with the species that treats stellar manipulation as a routine diplomatic option?" Rivera's smile carried the weight of someone who had just realized that her species had accidentally revolutionized galactic politics by being too stubborn to die quietly. "Probably shouldn't have tried to conquer us in the first place,"